Hello, everybody. Hi. How are you, Sophia?
It's good.
Good? Really? Kate?
Good morning.
Hi, Laynie.
Hello.
Hoa.
Bonjour.
We're very excited to come here together. We're going to be talking about a poem by Hoa Nguyen, who's right here. This is like a treat. We get to talk about a poem, and the poet is with us. And where are we? We're at the Word Bookstore at 469 Milton in Montreal. And this bookstore was founded in 1975. The poem we're about to discuss is from Vogue Magazine 1970, so it's, of that era. And the bookstore was founded by Adrian King Edwards, and we wanted to shout out to him for all the work he's done for the local and near local and, in fact, international literary scene. And a shout out to Scott Moody, who is here today and is helping us set this up. Also want to shout out to Holly York, who cannot be seen as off stage, but Holly came all the way from Atlanta, a long-time ModPo participant. So here we are. It's a great location for this conversation. And what would you be willing to read the poem, and then we'll talk about it?
Yeah, this poem appears in 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure. I didn't exactly write it, but it is my poem. From Vogue Magazine, 1970. This is the year of the Orient, of the Shanghai Express, the kimono, the obi belt, the lotus flower, the Korean rice picker, the crackles in ancient celadon vases, the murals of Tangwang, the Kangxi porcelain, the sang du boeuf, the Manchurian white forehead, the island of Yiso green, the Japanese clogs, the coolie hat, the enamel butterflies, the capes, all of which appeal to our fantasy in search of the lost paradise.
Thank you. Why don't we just offer each of us quickly a sense of what could possibly be meant by appealing to our fantasy? What is it about this list of things that supposedly, or in some sort of fashion sense, some mode sense, some trend sense, appeals to fantasy? Sophia, give us a start on that.
I'm thinking perhaps there's this yearning for like the aesthetically pleasing aspects of a culture that that is being appropriated here, and the fantasy is like being able to put it on and like think you understand or think you like are a part of it suddenly because it's the trend.
Kate?
These things are all a part of the long lost colonial days, and its whole history and situation of subjugation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laynie.
I love what Sophia and Kate said. And another layer is thinking about Vogue magazine in 1970s and how at that time the paper magazine was the main source for fashion, and it was mostly not representative of how most women look, and also not representative of very many different races, body types, ages, body size, but the magazine would present this false fantasy that was not attainable. It's kind of an illusion collage of beauty.
Fantastic. Well, I can see that the comments, and this is what one is going to think of and say about this fantasy thing. One can imagine a lotus flower as, a fashion extra, the sang du boeuf, the deep red Chinese glaze, which would be fashionable. But the coolie hat and the Korean rice picker, how does that fit in with this fashion fantasy?
That's a good question. I mean, it's kind of astonishing, really. And, this is a poem that, as I said, I didn't exactly write it, but it's mine, in that it's a found poem. When I saw coolie hat, I was like, wow, really? They're just being very quite bald with this language of colonization, of also like dehumanizing the other. Of course, that's a word. The coolie hat, I think, is literally talking about the Vietnamese cone-shaped hat, which, and of course, in 1970 would have been at the height of the war in Vietnam.
Astonishing that would be referred to in the context of fashion trend.
Yeah.
Is it really possible that in 1970 someone might buy a coolie hat for $40 and wear it to a party? Is that possible?
Probably not, but a lot of the images of Saigon, for example, in 1970, were, I think, catching the imagination of a lot of U.S. Americans, for example, in terms of fashion, in terms of this other place. There's also this sort of heroic effort that I think Americans felt that they were taking part in to, combat communism or save Vietnamese people.
I have a follow-up question for Hoa, but I think we should all speculate about this. Orientalism circa right after World War II is one thing, right? So the French get back into so-called French Indochina, and before the defeat of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, there was a moment of Orientalism. One can imagine sort of French Vietnam cuisine had hit Paris and was fashionable, etc. And one can imagine Orientalism of that era through the 50s being not so obviously offensive to many people. But this 1970, at the state of the Vietnam War, with the United States involved, Vogue Magazine doing explicit Orientalism, how do we even begin to think that this was okay in the minds of some editor at Vogue? Where do you even begin? Orientalism, 1970? Please.
It's pretty entrenched, and I think can be seen past 1970, certainly. And it's interesting, too, to think that Asian Americans who had been in North America for centuries at this point, or at least a century, wouldn't necessarily see themselves in the pages of Vogue magazine. In other words, they wouldn't actually be depicted. They would be mostly erased and replaced with people who were from European extraction, wearing, sort of the adopted, also like picked across many different cultures, and remixed together outside of their contexts. I think it's still, I think it persists. Yeah.
Laynie, let's begin to think about what this poet is doing by finding this text, putting in a book, 1,000 times you lose your treasure, with its implication of loss, and there's lost in this poem. We'll talk about loss in a minute. What does it mean, Laynie, for a poet to choose this, to implicitly, via poetry, make a comment on fantasy and loss? What does it mean for a poet to do this?
I was thinking about echoes of the title in the collection, specifically in related to loss, because there's many ways in which the book is considering loss. And so in this poem, found poem, as you say, there's a sense of what's erased, what's stolen, and as I was just saying, what still persists. So I was thinking about how, even though now there's still entrenched, racism, inequity, dehumanization, etc. In the 1970s, there was not even an awareness that maybe we should question this. I feel like there's more awareness about a way ahead, and than there was. So, but there's still this loss that's ongoing.
Kate, you want to follow up on that?
It is ongoing, but this poem to me is about its language, because what strikes me so hard about it is that you can still have and wear and decorate your home with most of these things, maybe with the exception of the coolie hats. You just can't say it this way anymore. So what really has changed in that time period?
Thus,
So-
we have a I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. But there are a lot of references to time in the poem, and the poem, as much as it is about its language, is about the time lapse between 1970 and now, and what has actually changed about this colonial situation.
It's the poem, the act of the poet is densely and powerfully historical. Wave Books publishes the book in 2021. Let's say that you've written these poems or found these poems in 2019, 2020, whatever. But let's just say 2021. So this is Waz 2021, contemplating through the act of appropriation of text, looking at an old Vogue of 1970 being a supposedly radical enlightened moment. The left in the U.S., the anti-war left, is big, no bigger than in 1970, 71. And yet, here this is. So I'm really curious about the historicity of this, of 2021's 1970. And we've sort of already suggested that there's not, surprisingly, not that much difference. And yet the poetic strategy that's used here probably wouldn't have been very familiar to a lot of people in 1970. That wasn't a question, Sophia, just something I wanted to say. But do you want to talk more about history and loss and absence and anything like that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have necessarily the knowledge to speak about the year 1970, but
Before your time.
a little bit. But to riff off the conversation of lost, like, obviously when we bring up the question of loss, we have to think who lost what and who took it. And I think to have this lostness situated within the context of this Vogue magazine, which is this dynamic of consumption for pleasure, or like a gaze, like providing something to look at for presumably pleasure or for replication, that's like there is this erasure of origin, because it's just about what I can get out of something, not where it came from.
Well, you know, there's a tradition of memorialization by listing. When we memorialize those mass murdered, we will typically find the anniversary of it and we will read the names. This is sort of the opposite end of that tradition. So can you comment on thinking about this as part of a tradition of listing things that are gone? Because there is going to be in you, I imagine, some sense of loss of some things. You write in other poems about this situation as well. Like, this culture, even the culture that's been made possible by Orientalism, is also gone. Is this making any sense?
Yeah, there's also no, there are no Asian humans in this. I guess the forehead is sort of a metonym of some kind. I mean, I would have been already in the U.S. by 1970. I was born in Vietnam, but we had immigrated quite early in the diaspora, of the Vietnamese diaspora. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the reasons I chose this too is like, but I'm American, but I'm also not in here. Although I'm referenced, it's also like a very strange, colonized and also insulting reference. But then also there's well, perhaps I'm also in search of the lost paradise, you know, which is the losing of one's ancestral land and also original language.
Wow. So the word fantasy, in a strange kind of way, you share a little bit. Wow. So I guess we should talk about loss. Let's all do that. I mean, a blurb, is it a blurb? Is it a review? I'm sorry, I didn't figure out what the source was, but refers to this as at turns lyrical and unsettling, the book, the poems of the book, and then refers to Hoa as writing a poetry that sings of language and loss. So let's talk about loss for a little while. And the poem refers to the appeal to our fantasy in search of the lost paradise. Who wants to talk about loss and poetry and absence and presence of words and sounds and clipping a magazine as a strategy? Kate.
It's speaking to Hua's characterization of her own experience. To me, the burning hot word in this poem is hour. In the end, whose fantasy is this? Who's included in that hour? I'm sure that's a complicated question for someone who crossed boundaries in this moment.
Can we start with what Vogue's editors or copywriters might have meant by hour? I don't read
Their
Vogue.
readers.
Hmm?
Their readers.
Yeah, the readers are the women who read this magazine, right? But you were extending it. Hour.
Well, it's just a boldly presumptive hour. We upper middle class white women our perspective is across all people.
Further on loss?
Well, I just want to repeat what Hoa said. Loss of land, loss of language. There's loss of family. There's also, in thinking about this lost paradise, loss of this illusion of innocence that's connected to what Kate said about the hour, and that there's a culpability implied in the hour. So in the 70s, a reader or a person who just didn't even wasn't aware that it could be problematic to just be, erasing and appropriating and dehumanizing. I think now, I would hope that it's impossible to have zero awareness. I'm sure it does happen, but to not to start to question, to be culpable, to be in the hour, is a loss of this idea of, everything is fine in the garden, everything is not fine in the garden. And it never was, but I think there was a time when more people could live their lives as if.
There's another sense of loss that I'm thinking about, which is very historical and political. Of course, that is something that was finally confirmed on April 30th, 1975, with the image indelible for everybody in the United States and around the world of embassy personnel and some other connected people trying to get onto the last helicopter at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. That's the moment when the United States, everybody realized there was a loss of a war. The war was lost, so it's a different kind of loss. 1970 is so strategic as a place to go in archiving in Vogue, because in 1970, people who were reading this would not have conceived of the war, the conflict in Vietnam, as a loss, a possible loss. Is that complicated, the idea of loss here and what you're doing with that?
Yeah, I think that date's very, very specific for the trajectory of the conflict of the war in Vietnam. I mean, obviously, 1968 was also a pivotal moment with the Tet Offensive, which I was present for, lived through with my mother, and which also propelled us to leave because it was so dangerous. Especially as a mixed race child, I would have been targeted by the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, they called themselves, so for me that date, you put your finger right on the importance of that date. It's interesting too to think this is a magazine for women, mostly white women, mostly women with some disposable income, presumably, and who were in the emerging liberation also. So for me, it's also a little bit tender in thinking about intersections of feminism.
So Lost Paradise, it refers most explicitly to the fantasy of the Orient, so-called Orient, as American consumers would like, because there was a big trend during the high modernist days of the teens and 20s, chinoiserie and a fad for haiku and all that stuff. But here, Lost Paradise also refers to the ignorance of the United States military history, and the Lost Paradise is like, oh fuck, we lost a war. Our war is lost. That's another Lost Paradise here. I wonder if we could go around and just collect some of the details, because this is not only about Vietnam. This is about Vietnam. Clearly, this poem's about Vietnam. But there is Shanghai, there's Korea, there's one of the large islands off Japan. Can we collect a few of those details and figure out, and this is a wide orient in Vogue. Who wants to start?
Well, I mean, the thing that strikes me about it is that there is no acknowledgement that these things are collected from different countries, different cultures, different. It's just lumped together as if it, as if that's what's.
That's such an important point, Laynie, because this is a huge territory we're talking about, and it's all kind of the same. It's all precious and trendy, equally trendy. Kate?
Well, and these details span cultures, but also time. I mean, there's huge swaths from, ancient times to the recent present. But this is the year of the Orient. It's all very fleeting. Next year, it's all gone again.
This is the year of. I forgot. We should talk about that. This is the year of. What?
Right. So it aesthetic. This aesthetic moment encompasses, millennia, but it's only here for a minute, and then we'll put it away again.
Yeah. Sophia, you want to add to that?
I was also thinking, Kate, about this is the year, and how they only get one, and then it's back to like
right, thousands of years of human culture.
Yeah.
But this is the year.
And like Vogue magazine gets to determine that. I'm also thinking about how like there's so much like also lost utility in some of these in this list of things. Like some of this is for vanity reasons, some of it has utility, and some of it has, and all of it has a lost origin and a lost and it's been misappropriated in a list that equalizes everything across cultures and across purposes.
The Manchurian white forehead is worth saying something about. I'll start, and I don't know what others think. If you're 30, between 20 and 30, reading Vogue in 1970, you're reading it to see what the trends are, but you're going to look for knockoff things because you're not going to have the money to buy this stuff. It's probably, the ideal audience is probably 40 to 50 with the income, right? So that means you're born in 1920. That means that when the Japanese Empire, the fascist empire of Japan, invaded Manchuria, is that 34, 35, something like that, which is sometimes called the quote-unquote, forgive the word, the rape of Nanking. That's Manchuria. This Manchurian white forehead somehow is a kind of post-traumatic image of the top of a woman's head somehow. And that is like, so every 50-year-old who's thinking of buying some of this stuff would encounter that and have some memory of the 12-point type headlines in the New York Times talking about Manchuria. Can we look at some of these other things as specifically historical? Shanghai Express, maybe. Maybe there aren't any that are so specific as Manchuria, but let's see. What's an obi belt? I don't even know. I didn't look it up.
It's with the kimono.
Oh,
the
kimono.
belt,
So the kimono and obi
that a woman would wear with her kimono. Yeah, thanks for drawing that detail out. I feel like there are these that this poem is looking at, or is highlighting how this violence, these coded violences here.
Okay, well, I mentioned the Korean rice picker and coolie hat as really being in a completely off-kilter piece of advertising prose. That's really off-kilter. So I would call it proletarian chic, right? If you're really going to buy a coolie hat in 1970, you're bought into some idea that I can identify with workers, keep the sun out, and look pretty cool. what? So proletarian chic in 1970 really leans a little left. So the 50-year-old lady who's shopping can think about her 18-year-old daughter who's out wearing a Mao jacket. To throw in a detail that's not in here. What do you think of that? Is proletarian chic not the right phrase for this?
Well, there's also the enamel butterflies and the capes. Like, you can have it all, high and low. As long as it's oriental, it's great this year.
Yeah, this is the year. Let's go around for final thoughts on this extraordinary piece. I mean, I'm still interested in some or all of us talking about the poetic strategy of what sometimes is called appropriation, which would be super duper complicated in this context.
Reappropriation.
Yeah.
Reappropriation, right. Appropriation of the appropriation. Yeah,
It's a reclamation in a context that calls attention to the like absolute wrongness of the original context of this
Right.
of this writing.
Good. Is that going to be your final thought?
Yes.
Okay, good. Kate?
As a copywriter, I can't help pointing out the terrible syntax at the end, all of which appeal to our fantasy in search of the lost paradise.
It's all wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect it to read appeal to our fantasy of the lost paradise, but someone threw this search in there just to twice remove it from anything actual.
Yeah. I hear a little, and Lost Horizon was had a big resurgence in the late 60s. It was read in schools. I read it as a student. You have to understand Asia. Read Lost Horizon. Is this book in currency? Oh, anyway, I think it's a reference to that. Laynie?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the word fashion and how that is related to conspicuous consumption, and then how that is related to fashion of the language that we use, including literary language and theoretical language that comes in and out of fashion and has a relationship to the politics and the daily lives that we lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, final thought on your own.
Just thank you so much for the attention to this piece. It's fun when it's a piece that you didn't write, and yet you frame and place. So the repositioning and the reappropriation, as I said, was an element that I wanted for sure to draw out.
Do you have a story? You may not. Do you read this poem at readings sometimes, or did you?
Typically.
And you wouldn't because?
The first poem in the book uses the word mise en scène. I feel like it's part of the mise en scène, like more of the dressing of the set than say maybe the event or animated parts.
One last question. What does 1970 mean to you now at this point?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned, 1975, which is the fall of Saigon. If you were from the South, if you were from the North, you would call it the liberation of Saigon. But it's the 50th anniversary coming up, so it's been on my mind. 1970 for me, it's like, oh yeah, it's the beginning of this decade that, as you said, was heralded as sort of like advancing our consciousness, the age of Aquarius and whatnot. So it's only 4 years before women were able to open a bank account or get a credit card in the U.S. Without a husband, so it's interesting, these plays on liberation and consciousness raising with the way in which language here is enacting these violences and assumptions.
So much of that moment of this is appealing to women who have their husband's credit card or cash to buy this shit. But they really couldn't have their own account. So the cynicism of advertising this stuff, while the men who could vote actually were voting in 1968 for Nixon as opposed to Humphrey, right? Or in 1972, Nixon as opposed to McGovern, who was anti-war. So the guys are over there doing their vote, and the women are being appealed to on the basis of this Orientalism. Speaking of 1975, this bookstore, the Word Bookstore, was founded in 1975. And I'm pretty sure that back then, when there were a lot of readings in this store, which Scott has mentioned to us, there were a lot of readings that had a lot to do with these issues. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that 50 years later is 2025. That's the 50th anniversary. So we're in the right place to talk about this book. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was great.